Hey y'all, it's Michelle with SLP Full Disclosure, and today we are joined by an amazing guest, another fellow speech-language pathologist, Michelle Garcia Winner from California. So Michelle, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm super excited to have you on the show and talk about this amazing topic that I know all speech-language pathologists are going to want to hear about. So let me tell you guys a little bit about Miss Winner. Michelle Garcia Winner is the founder of Social Thinking, CEO of Think Social Publishing, Inc., and a globally recognized thought leader, author, speaker, and social cognitive therapist. Over her 35-plus year career, she has developed the social thinking methodology along with Dr. Pamela Crook, which provides evidence-based strategies and curricula to help individuals of all ages develop social competencies by deeply connecting social, emotional, and cognitive development. Michelle's work emphasizes the impact of social competencies on relationships, academic performance, and career success. So,
Great.
wow, Michelle, you've got an amazing career behind you, and we're going to be talking today about something that I came across in my personal life. I've been a speech-language pathologist for 25 years. And of course, over the course of my career, I've worked with students who have autism. We've done social skills training. We've done all of these social skills, different things, small groups, and that sort of thing. I have a nephew who is on the autism spectrum. And my sister is the one that told me about social thinking. And that is what our topic is about today, the social thinking methodology. And I will tell you, the one thing that she told me that was the most profound in helping my nephew, who is now in his 20s, was that it helped him learn how to deal with the immediacy of those social anxieties and those social situations.
Right.
Of course, from early intervention all the way through, he has been to, countless social skills training.
Mm-hmm.
But when she finally connected with a psychologist in Memphis, Tennessee, who uses the social thinking methodology, she said it was almost like a light bulb went off for him. And the example that she gave me was that he had really bad anxiety about using his debit card, okay? Because he would often forget his PIN number. And so he already had, and we're going to talk a lot more about the anxiety that goes along with the social. But she said he would already have a little bit of anxiety when he would go out into public because he would forget his PIN number and it would upset him. It would embarrass him. And so that's one of the things that they helped work with him on, is how to deal with those situations and what are concrete things that he can do in the moment. Because she said previously, the other social groups that they had been to talked a lot about the if-then. If this happens, then this is how you respond.
Right.
So let's get into it, Michelle. Let's talk about social thinking. I want you to first tell us a little bit about your background, where you've been in your career as a speech-language pathologist, and how you came about to develop social thinking methodology.
All right. Well, I'm from California, but I got into graduate school at Indiana University in Bloomington, and I went out there mid-year, and so I didn't start right into the program, but I heard there was a nonprofit on campus that was helping individuals with autism.
Okay.
This is back in the early 80s, and the only people we recognized as having autism at that point were those who had significant language and cognitive challenges.
Right.
And so I had the good fortune to be mentored by a woman named Nancy Dalrymple, who was a master's level teacher, and she taught us compassionate behaviorism. So the students were coming out of institutions. They'd been living in institutions. They were completely dysregulated. They did not know any kind of routine or functional aspects of communication.
Wow.
So I started making communication boards on manila folders with pictures because we had no technology then.
Right.
And I started sewing communication boards that would go over the shoulder so you could go out in the community. And even then, we were taking them into the community, into restaurants, skiing, all these different things. And I saw the power of compassionate behaviorism, which means you think about the person as a human and not as a just set of behaviors. And so I found that really helpful and really interesting, and certainly a program these students were, for the most part, doing better in. Out of the 15 or 20 students in this program, 2 of them did not succeed, no matter how hard we tried, no matter how much we individualized. And that was also a lesson that we're not going to be, even with the best heart and the best knowledge and the best strategies,
it may not work.
Percent success.
Mm-hmm.
Anyhow, I then, because I started having children, moved back home to California. And I went to work in head injury and stroke and learned a ton about executive functioning, cognitive learning. Martha Burns was speaking back then, and she was on the cutting edge of really thinking about more cognitively based therapies rather than behaviorally based. And so I learned a ton about just higher order thinking when you work with people who have lost skills rather than work with people who were born into weakness.
Right.
Then you start to see a whole different side of learning. So I was fascinated by that. And then I went to work in a high school because my kids were now school aged. And as a speech pathologist in a high school district, I've always liked working with older kids. The kids were angry. They did not want speech therapy. They were tired of being told how to behave. They were really mad about it.
Right.
So I had them on my caseload. I needed to see them, but they were just totally rejecting the idea of coming. And so I started talking to them and just, I was behind a closed door. No one knew what I did in there.
Right. So they never know. They always put you in a closet somewhere in the back room. Nobody knows what you do. Right.
It sure gave me an opportunity to find out from them what was compelling to them. What were the things they were needing help with? Yeah. And it turned out a lot of it was figuring out people on campus. And it wasn't just do the behavior. It was, why do people gather in groups when, the break bell orders? How do you even get into a group? And that really got me to start thinking that we got to do more than teach behaviors. We really got to teach folks to think about the social thinking that's happening around us to make decisions about how best to enter into a group or participate or choose not to. And so that led to a place where I learned that really what my students need to start with is social observation. They weren't doing that. They'd never been taught to do that. They were just like in the middle of a situation feeling anxious because they didn't know what was happening.
Right.
And if you look at your own thinking, the listeners just look at themselves, you'll notice that we always observe what's going on around us. Who are the people? What's the situation? What's happening before we say or do something? There's always a social observation component. Folks on the autism spectrum, folks with ADHD or a range of other diagnoses, including speech and language, challenges, are not strong observers. Some of them have no sense of social observation. What they've been taught is do this behavior.
Right.
If then.
If this happens, this is how you respond. Right. And that is not effective.
Doesn't teach you. Now, this is for our work is for folks who have solid to strong language and learning beginning at 4 years old. We don't use social thinking for anything younger than that because it's a language-based curriculum that teaches about awareness of what's happening and gives time to really encourage social observation before you start working on what to do in a situation. You and I, the listener, we largely figure out what to do in a situation by observing what's happening in the situation.
You're right.
And trying to figure out, who are these people? Is this a good time? Is this even in class? Is this a good time to ask for help? Is it not a good time to ask for help?
Right.
Should I talk to my peer? Shouldn't I talk to my peer? And so that's a huge part of our curriculum. So if you're working with school-age kids who are 4 years old up through elementary school, you're going to possibly see kicking around your school a curriculum called You Are a Social Detective.
Okay.
Because we really get into our second edition, really make sure we're teaching students to observe. And then we use in elementary school something like Superflex to teach students to be increasingly flexible and start to understand what's happening inside of them and what they can do. What unthinkables are showing up in their brain and what thinkables can help them regulate. So that turns into the beginning with social regulation.
Right.
We also have information for all the way up in age. My oldest client's in his 70s and is a lawyer.
Wow.
I'm actively working now with another attorney who is in his 30s who has massive social anxiety. But the more he's a relatively new client, the more I learn about him, he has no sense of social observation. He's very good at what he does. He's a very good researcher, but he's not part of the team in any kind of social way because he just goes into his silo and does research. So I'm working with him on how do you observe and how do you observe when your anxiety is shutting you down.
Let's talk about that anxiety piece. We talked about this a little bit the other day on our intro call. How does that social anxiety play a role in your ability to observe what's going on? Because I think that as I've gotten older, I have self-diagnosed myself with a little bit of social anxiety. I get really nervous when I'm around people that I don't know.
Sure.
This conversation with you and I doesn't make me nervous because it's just you and I. But when I'm with a large group of people, but I have normal language skills, I feel like I'm a good observer. So how does that anxiety play a role in your ability to observe what's going on around you?
In our methodology, we talk about two types of anxiety. And one type of anxiety usually happens with people who are very literal, do not interpret information. And so that's part of the autism spectrum. If you know the autism spectrum as level 1, 2, 3, when you're getting into level 2 and 3, you're noticing people have a harder time observing abstract information.
Right.
But those folks have what we call world-based anxiety. They don't anticipate transitions well, and they get very upset with change,
right,
and transition, and can get into some kind of shutdown mode. So the classic recommendations for that are you build a transition plan, you have your schedule highly visible, you work with them on preparing for change. Mm-hmm. So that's one type of anxiety. The type you're talking about is for those who are more nuanced. They have more abstract abilities, but they're also aware. They often feel that they're not as strong, or they worry that they don't have that ability in that moment, the here and now of social communication, to participate. And so they become socially anxious. The only people I think who have social anxiety, and it's a big group, are those who have self-awareness that people have thoughts about them. When you're really literal, you don't have self-awareness that people are thinking about you. That's too abstract an idea.
That's too abstract, right.
And so we often have them on tight behavioral programs because they don't have an internal metacognitive voice helping to guide them. Mm-hmm. But to the rest of us, social anxiety is something every single person in the world experiences. Mm-hmm. And everyone has some familiarity with social anxiety. Where it becomes really a problem is when it's compelling social anxiety, when the social anxiety stops you from approaching somebody or doing something that you want, need, or wish you could do. And so what I ended up doing, as a speech pathologist, I had no training in mental health and no training in anxiety. So I went and looked at how we work with social anxiety with just the general population. Mm-hmm. And I found that it assumed that you had all this great social knowledge, and that wasn't going to be particularly helpful for our folks who don't have great social knowledge. So I created my own spiral of success and spiral. My students, my teenagers and young adults called it the spiral of failure, which is what they often feel like they get stuck on.
Yeah.
But in the spiral of success, it's you're familiar with what's going on. You know you have strategies to handle this. Like one of the things we all do when we're communicating face-to-face is we physically approach people.
Right.
We observe the situation, we physically approach, as we approach and enter the situation, then we use our eyes to show people that we're listening to them. And our eyes may shift around. We don't have to stare at people's eyes. We just look towards that person who's speaking. And then the fourth step is, as you're watching and listening, you're thinking about how this applies to you or what information you could add to the discussion. And then you use language to relate. That's called our 4 steps of communication. And what we help people to see is these 4 steps are in face-to-face communication involve this physicality. And that's often what makes people stressed out.
That's what I was about to say. That's what makes them nervous.
Is you know, in general, we stand about 1 arm's length from each other. And when groups come in, when people come into groups, our bodies shift and we're constantly shifting a little bit to acknowledge people are coming into groups. And then we're what we call think with our eyes. We're thinking about what's going on. We're listening with our ears and we're trying to figure out, is this something I can relate to?
Right.
And so we have a lot of strategies that teach about communication itself, such as there's, we either make comments or add questions. So when you're listening to someone and they're telling you something about their weekend, that's a great time for you to add your thought about your weekend.
Your weekend. Right. That reciprocal communication.
Listening and we usually imagine as we listen. It's not just in our ears, it's obviously in our brain, but we imagine what people are telling us. Right. And as we imagine that, we start to imagine how that relates to our own experiences. So we may ask a question because we're imagining something and we can't quite fully picture what that person's telling us. Or we add thoughts to share how we relate in some way to what's being said.
Right. Wow. I think you kind of answered one of my questions I had was, how is the social thinking methodology different from other social skills training programs? And I think that what we just talked about is what differentiates it.
We actually don't think of ourselves as a social skills program because we believe when people talk about social skills, they're focusing on the behavior a person is doing.
Right.
So social thinking is figuring out the situation and the people for you to figure out your own goal. What is it you want to do? What are you trying to accomplish? And what you do to help accomplish that goal.
Right. And we were talking the other day when you said you have to understand your own internal feelings first and foremost before I can be able to say how the person I'm communicating with or another person in a group is feeling. So you've got that ability to recognize and understand those internal social cues.
Right. Because social communication is highly emotional and we use a lot of language, so it seems like it's very language based, but riding underneath that is our emotionality, which leads to which words do we use to talk about things? What topics should we talk about? What topics shouldn't we talk about? Even in the course of this interview, what's okay to say, what's not okay to say.
Right.
And so you have to consider your audience. And largely, I'm not quite sure who's listening to this, so I'm going to stay very high level on this. So in social thinking, we teach people to be aware of their feelings. And when we feel, we don't feel with language. We feel internally. Some people are familiar with the word introception, and that's kind of what's going on inside of you. And a big thing going on inside of you are your feelings. So we'll do some things in our work. We have a little emoticon graph and a little line that goes across to have people map out how their feelings are shifting across a period of time. Because feelings are unlike moods. Moods stick around like a weather system, but feelings are constantly shifting. Changing. And helping people to realize, like when they say, when you say you had a bad day, it actually doesn't mean that all parts of the day were bad. It means there was some part of the moment in that day that didn't feel that great, but you could do this little graph and find out, oh yeah, I had fun at lunch. I was joking around with my friends. And I liked this particular teacher, so that was pretty good. But when I got my bad grade in my test, that was awful. So it was
that one bad moment that kind of sticks out that then puts a cloud over the whole day to say, I had a bad day, when it was really just when I got my math test back, I didn't do well on it.
Yeah, I was working I was a lot of counselors and psychologists refer people to us because they're not quite sure how to break down information to build up competencies, which is
Yes,
what
ma'am.
we're all about.
Mm-hmm.
So they had a man in his 30s, an engineer, and he would come in to see me. He works for a company you've all heard of. And he always was very pleasant when I first saw him. And then he would go, just so frustrated. I'm always angry. I don't always want to be angry. And so I started coming up with, I noticed in the group when he talked to me, not the group, just the two of us, I noticed that he wasn't angry, but he was never accounting for that. So I started, he said to me, why do I always feel this way? And it was right before summer break. I said, I don't know, but I'm going to read all about feelings this summer and emotions, and I'm going to have some answers for you.
Mm-hmm.
So I did this deep dive into feelings and emotions, something us speech pathologists don't usually do.
Right. We don't have training in that.
But social communication is all emotional. Right?
That is so important. You're right.
Figure some of this out. So anyway, I learned about feelings, and I started using words. Feelings are what you feel. Emotions are the words you use to describe your feelings.
Mm-hmm.
You can feel a lot and not have words to describe it.
Mm-hmm.
So we really distinguish between your feeling and what would be the words you could use to describe your feeling. In speech path, I think when we do this, we always start with the words, happy, bad, sad.
You're right. We
We're
do.
more interested in the person and what they're experiencing. So that's why we use this emoticon scale with a line for the feelings journal so they could actually put some points on it. You know, at 8 a.m. when I got to school or when I woke up, I was feeling grumpy. So they do a little bit. Got to school was fine. And then I got to hang out with my friends. That was good. Then I was sitting in this class and I was bored. So that goes lower on the feeling scale. And then we just map it out. And people then get a sense of, okay, my feelings are changing. I'm really not parked in one way.
Right.
So that engineer, when he started learning this, was like, oh my God, I actually am happy. I just never took notice of the purpose.
Right. Because those bad moments are the ones that always stick out. I mean, you could have a wonderful day and then you come home and one bad thing happens and then you go to bed that night thinking my whole day was ruined when your whole day wasn't really ruined.
Exactly what the brain researchers found out is that our brain is designed to really pay attention to the negative experience because that's what we problem solve from.
Mm-hmm.
When you have a positive experience, it's lovely, but we don't dwell there. In fact, we don't even take much time talking about it. It'll be like, oh yeah, I had a good time at the party. But when I was talking to this person, I couldn't believe they said da, 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 da. And then I, started talking to them about how miserable I am.
Right.
So finding your conversations, we bitch together, if I'm allowed to say that word.
Yeah. I mean, and I was just about to say that because we talked about that the other day, that it's those negative moments or those times when you're having a bad day that you call your girlfriend and you say, hey, let me tell you. And you said something about, because we bitch together and it's that negativity that brings us together and to have that conversation about that bad situation. But when I've had a wonderful day, which after this podcast, I know I'm going to be on cloud 9, I'm not going to call my friends and say, let me tell you about my wonderful day. But very quickly to say, hey, let me tell you what a crap day I had.
In fact, if you do spend a lot of time talking about how wonderful something was and people are not relating to it, now you're seen as bragging.
Oh,
right?
Okay.
So, the research literally shows that we build relationships off of complaining together. And
really?
So in our sessions, we should be really encouraging kids to complain together, right?
Interesting.
So many of our sessions when we're teaching social is we're always teaching pro-social, be nice, be positive, say nice things. And that's a really quick way to have people not want to talk to you.
Right.
Right.
Because if that's what you're talking about, being happy, but internally you're not feeling that way because, again, you've got to have that awareness of your internal feelings. The feelings, I love that. I think that's the biggest thing I've learned, the feelings and the emotions. I love that. Because
and I think this holds true to those who are more nuanced. But if you're a very literal person, you might think you are happy all day because you actually don't have a great radar for sensing
Gauge that.
feelings changing. So keeping aware on the autism spectrum, one of the things, if that's one group of people you're working with, just how uniquely different they are and how they need, like we should never put social groups together that are just the entire autism spectrum.
Right.
Because then you have the most literal, unaware students with the most nuanced, and the more nuanced kids are getting frustrated. And, this is part of what motivated me to keep defining these things, because students would say, when you put me in that group, then I think you think that I'm just like those people.
Right.
And I'm not like those people. So I'm going to act out so I can get out of this group, because that group is not for me.
Right.
And so in our work, we started talking about these subtypes, and we have the subtle but sophisticated group.
Wow.
That makes subtle social subtle social errors, right? Versus the really obvious social errors of the more literal group. And it's that life of subtlety that makes us more anxious, because there's just subtle little things we could do.
Right. And we talked about
listener could imagine a time where they left some kind of conversation face to face or whatever, and they felt like, oh, I should not have said that.
Right.
Right.
100%.
Oh, I wish I had said that, because it's all about these subtleties.
Right. And there's no, like you were saying, there's no one size fits all. Social communication and social interactions, the feelings, the emotions, there's not one size that fits all. You can't just say, okay, you have autism, so this is what we're going to do. Because no one individual is the same. And we talked about this the other day, that you and I could be having a conversation with a third person, and that person could say something, and you may perceive it as being sarcastic. And I may say, no, I don't think they were being sarcastic, because we perceive things so differently.
Well, you bring up a good point. All communication is interpreted. If we're at the nuance level, everything's interpreted, and it's easy to misinterpret or for there to be multiple interpretations. So that's part of, like in school, when kids work in groups, part of the value of a group work is to get different people's perspective. Not everyone's interpreting the project the same way, or different minds have different things that they think are important. And there's a real value in group work because of the uniqueness of each contribution. And many of our folks on the autism spectrum who are at this higher level, this more nuanced level, I should say, they have some really unique ways they see things. And they're, companies on Silicon Valley want to hire a person who thinks uniquely.
Right.
And, then work to help them learn how to collaborate in groups and things like that.
Wow. I've learned so much just in this few minutes that we've been talking. So let's get back to the social thinking methodology, because what I really want is for our listeners to be able to tap into this information and this methodology that you have developed. Because when I went to your website, and we're going to have all of that linked below, the information is just so incredible. It's easy to read. It's easy to understand. It makes sense. And what you talked about today it just makes sense, because we've really got to take a step back and start looking at it a little differently.
So a key thing in our social thinking methodology is social thinking vocabulary. Because we all participate in the social world, but we really don't know how we're participating in it. We just do it.
We just do it.
So people who aren't great at understanding the social world need more guidance. So I started with developing specific vocabulary to help them, when they're socially observing, to help them notice what they're observing. So think with your eyes, whose body's in the group, whose body's out of the group, what is the group plan? How do we think flexibly, make smart guesses? Those are the inferences. And so we have 10 of these social thinking vocabulary that we use, because you can't just say to someone, go observe. They have no idea what they're observing.
They don't know what they're looking for, right?
Or it's like, is a person's body in the group? Not in the group. Does that person, are they using language to talk to you, or are they just monologuing? I was working with another man who was an amazingly smart person, who lived in Australia, and he was doing some things as a teenager. He was talking to people in Silicon Valley about what he was developing, and they flew him to the United States to have him work with them. And he was developing email.
Oh, wow.
He's one of the founders of this whole concept. So he's brilliant, but socially just very anxious because he doesn't understand how the social world works. So I end up working with him, and we end up talking about being in restaurants, about how you think with your eyes. And when you're in a restaurant and you're trying to get the attention of a wait staff, you think with your eyes. You look towards that person, and as they catch your eye, then you signal them.
Try to make contact. Yeah.
So this brilliant man says, I had no idea. I had no idea all that was happening. He goes, I go to restaurants and I just sit there, and it is like no one ever comes up to me. And you can imagine he's just kind of buried, whether he has his cell phone in front of him or whatever. He's not looking attentive. He's not sending any cues. And he's like, often we'll hear from adults, why hasn't anyone told me this?
Why didn't you tell me that? Why didn't someone tell me that 20 years ago? Right.
So as I learned more and more from my adults, I started thinking, well, if the adults don't know this, the kids don't know.
Kids don't know it either. Right.
Start teaching all of this to the kids, the teenagers, the teens.
Right.
And then you graduate, and all of a sudden you're supposed to be independent.
Yeah.
But so many of our kids have had so many helpers wrapped around them. They are not operating on independence at all.
Right. Because they've had so much support.
Go to university, and the university is like, we're not here to baby you. If you can't figure out your strategies, we're not helping you.
Right.
You're an adult now. And the parent wants to come in and help, and they're like, no, parent, child's 18. You no longer can come talk to a teacher. Your child needs to be their own advocate.
And they don't know how.
A lot we need to do when a kid is 11 and 12 to get them to work towards more and more independence to help prepare them for that transition to adulthood.
Right. And we talked about this. I want the speech pathologists listening to know that the social thinking methodology is not something that's designed just for speech language pathologists to use in their therapy sessions. It can be used across different disciplines. Like my nephew was introduced to your methodology through a psychologist. But it's also, your website has materials and information for parents. And you don't have to have a special certification to be able to implement or use social thinking methodology, correct?
Right. In fact, the best way to learn how to use it is to think about it yourself. When I'm waiting in a line at Starbucks, I'm not just waiting on a line. What am I doing?
You're observing.
Are people reading my intentions? What is it I need to do to clearly communicate with the cashier when I'm one step away from the cashier, someone's in front of me? How do I need to be aligning my body at this point? Like all these subtle things we do that we take for granted are what we don't take for granted in social thinking. So that's what I'm talking about. We break it down to explain what's going on, help people observe it, and then build up competencies. But we never start by having somebody change a behavior. We always start with trying to figure out what's going on around me. I do want to say, though, and I think I mentioned it, I just want to emphasize it. When you have social anxiety, what happens is you become more and more anxious inside of you, and it's like you're folding yourself inside of you, and it shuts off social observation. Because you're just standing there watching yourself feel more and more anxious. It's almost like you're growing roots into the ground. And I noticed this when I was taking my teenagers out in the community, and we had these plans and all the things they wanted to communicate with going into stores and buying things. And a couple of my students, they just couldn't move. Once we got in front of the store, they could not go in.
They were paralyzed.
They couldn't move. And I'm like, what's going on? So then we just talked out loud, like, what's happening inside your brain right now that's keeping you paralyzed right here? And it was that all of a sudden they just felt so anxious that they're going to screw up or mess up in some way.
Right. Kind of like my nephew with the PIN number. And, what are some concrete things that you can put into place before you go into those social situations so that you have a way out or an answer before you get there, because it's already a situation that's causing you
Or
anxiety.
Yeah. Text yourself the PIN number, use it, and then destroy that text.
My sister said that the lady that was working with him, because he would go to a group, but then she would also work with him individually, and she took him out to use his PIN, to use his debit card, and he had forgotten it. So, but she had gotten it from my sister before they went out, and so they created a locked photo in his phone that he can access when he forgets it, and it's locked in his phone, it's saved, and now he knows it. And she said it hasn't happened since, a year and a half ago.
Right. And that's a great example of teaching independence, because we really have to make ourselves not be so helpful. We're all about giving strategies to help the student be able to take care of themselves. So that's a great example of giving strategies to take care of it versus come with me to the PIN machine because, the ATM, because I get too stressed out.
Right.
So somebody's there telling him that PIN number is not a good idea at all.
Right. And I think that the biggest thing for me in reading your website, listening to the experiences that my sister had with the psychologist that my nephew did, is that it's concrete and it's not the what if. When I think back to, I've been doing this 25 years, you've been doing it 35. Way back in the day, in the 90s, when I was starting out, it was the what if. Okay, well, if you're at a restaurant and you want to get someone's attention, this is what you do. But what if those situations that we're teaching never happen? And that might not be what's causing the anxiety. And that might not be what's causing those internal feelings of, I don't know how to respond and I don't know how to react. So it's very individual too.
So we really encourage flexibility, right? So you're observing. You have to stay flexible. If we give you a script, because a lot of people will give folks scripts.
Yep.
Scripts are not flexible. And then if the script doesn't work, you're nowhere.
Right.
So we are kind of anti-script.
I love that.
It's about observing and learning to participate in the ways
adapt
based on your goals. And built into that is, hey, you know what? Every single person also messes up. It's okay to mess up, right? So one of the things I tell my clients, I have a 40-year-old coming in today, and he has a lot of anxiety. Again, I'm a speech pathologist, but counselors and social workers are sending me these clients because they don't know, they're not trained in breaking this stuff down. But as he comes in, working with him on flexibility, so I have a flexibility scale, and these are just simple scales. Drop, 2 lines, one in the middle, and you call it the flexibility scale. We encourage flexibility. What are some things that required high flexibility this week? What was a routine that you always do so it's not flexible? And then when you try something new or it's more flexible but it makes you anxious, then we have another scale, which is what's the risk? What risk are you taking if you talk to this person? Oh, I know what I was going to say. One of the things I work with this man a lot on, or constantly remind him, is socially, when we're with others, people want you to succeed. If you don't succeed, it's hard on everybody.
Right.
So if you're messing up a little bit, people will jump in and help you out. They'll go, oh, are you trying to say this? Or I had a situation like that where I just couldn't remember what I was going to say. We're very empathetic and we support each other. So my guys who have anxiety, they feel like they're always failing. But it's actually, wait a minute, trust the other people.
Trust your
what's your
partner.
goal? What do you want to accomplish? And if it's not perfect, that's okay. We're flexible. What's the risk?
Right.
Whenever you show the risk scale, the client always realizes, oh, I guess there's really no risk.
Right. There really isn't.
And this is not a job interview. This is social.
Right.
So just social, relating to others. Let me just add that COVID really did a number on people's confidence, especially children.
I know.
Who are in the school age years. The shock to the system was that the world doesn't operate the way we thought it did.
Right.
And that all of a sudden we're staying home full time. So the impact of COVID and the anxiety it has caused collectively to students, whether they're diagnosed or not, is really significant.
Yeah, I've always said we're going to see the impacts of that for many years to come. Many years.
seeing it now. And so social anxiety is actually something that we shouldn't, it's not really let's rule out social anxiety. Let's work with every single person with strategies for social anxiety. Because we're all, even before COVID, we all experienced it to some level. But post-COVID, all that 1 year, 1.5 years where people were not face-to-face, all of a sudden they lost their confidence, especially kids who really important developmental years of that.
Right. Those critical learning years, especially those kids. And I think I mentioned this the other day. My daughter said that she can see a difference because she's a middle school math teacher. And just those kids, 3 years from when she started until 3 years, the difference in those social skills, she said it is vast. And that's, obviously this is not her area of expertise. She's the numbers person in my family. But she said it's amazing just their ability to communicate and get along with one another. She said just body awareness, being able to sit at a table or sit at a desk or walk down the hall and bump into someone. She said it's vastly different just in 3 years in those groups.
A big part of that is it's even more complicated with our watches and our phones because none of us want to look like we're not part of something. So we whip up our phone and then we're part of something going on our phone. So when people are standing around being somewhat vulnerable, like just what are we going to talk about? If they're not comfortable with that, then everyone just whips out their phone. And now you'll see 4 kids standing around all with their phones up like this.
Right.
And that is actually fostering social anxiety because they're not feeling comfortable just being able to relate. They need some kind of structure that phone provides. Take the phone away, then kids are on their watches.
I do that. Michelle, I do that. I just met friends last weekend for dinner and I got there first. And I was sitting at the table and I was looking around and within 10 seconds I had my phone and I was looking. You're right. I do that because you don't want to.
When you say you're by yourself, but when others join,
then I put my phone away. But I did feel very vulnerable sitting at that desk, at that table with all these people around me because the thought went through my mind, oh, look at that poor lady over there having dinner by herself, right? That was an internal feeling and that was an internal negative thought that I had that no one was thinking that, right?
And the lady probably wasn't either. They just did this article on people who eat by themselves. Other people might feel sorry for them, but they're totally, a lot of times, just totally happy. You might not be, I might not be, but, our social brain's constantly casting judgment. It's a very judgmental entity. And we have to be aware that it has all these biases in it that may not be other people's biases.
And honestly, they probably didn't even notice that I was sitting there. But then there I was sitting there thinking, oh, they're probably thinking, well, look how sorry, I feel so sorry for her. But you're probably right. Gosh, Michelle, it has been so amazing. I could sit here and talk to you. I'm looking at the time. I think I've talked to you longer than I've talked to any of my guests. So
let me just share on our website, you were going to mention this, but we were just talking about social anxiety. We have a free article on the spirals of anxiety. So if you put in our search bar, the spirals of anxiety, and you'll get an article which will show these to you and talk you through how to use it. You don't start by addressing students' anxiety. You start by teaching them to be aware and develop aspects of competencies. We don't teach someone to be fully competent, and none of us are fully competent.
Right.
But we build competencies. And so that's one of the many, many free articles on our website.
I love that.
Webinars.
And I definitely want to talk about that because your website, like I said, is absolutely incredible. So hats off to your web designer because it is so useful and there is so much information. And I'm going to read, there was a neurodiversity article on there that caught my eye and I didn't have time to read the whole thing, but that's one that I've got in my mind. I'm like, I'm going back to read that one. So Michelle, before we finish, I always ask my guests, what is one piece of advice that you would give to speech language pathologists who are struggling with their students who are on the spectrum or who are having difficulties in that area of social skills? What's one piece of advice you would give them?
If these folks have self-awareness, I would lean into learning from them what their experience is and not think you have to be the most knowledgeable person in the room. The more they can teach you about themselves, the more you can figure out how to help them. But often when we're given a caseload, we think we're the ones who have to be implementing all this information.
And doing the teaching.
Social thinking is always about, what are you thinking about? What do you notice? And you can ask them questions like when the bell rings and everybody, what's at lunchtime, what do you do for lunch?
Mm-hmm.
Then let them tell you, and then you can start envisioning, are they sitting by themselves? Are they sitting with others? Are they talking to anybody? But it's really about you finding out about their life rather than you thinking you're going to teach them something meaningful to them if you haven't applied it in a way that makes sense based on their experience.
Oh my gosh, that is so profound. I love that we don't have to be the ones to be teaching. We need to be letting our students teach us so that we can then help them.
And you will then find your student is much more motivated to come see you if you're interested in them.
Yes, you're right. Oh, Michelle, I want to set up a weekly meeting with you. I want you to work with me on my social anxieties. This has been absolutely so informative and so helpful. I want our listeners to know socialthinking.com. And Michelle, you said that you guys are also on social media. And so you're going to get us those tags so that we can make sure that our listeners can find you guys. But Michelle, thank you from the bottom of my heart. I'm so humbled that you took time to meet with us and talk to us about the social thinking methodology. It has been amazing and I love it. So guys, stop what you're doing. Go to socialthinking.com. Start learning more about this methodology and reach out to us on social media. I'm sure if we can't answer your questions, we'll get you in touch with people who can. So, Michelle Winner, thank you so much for joining us. It has been great, and we'll talk to y'all soon. Thank you for tuning in to SLP Full Disclosure. You can learn more about this episode and our show on our website at amnhealthcare.com. If you enjoyed this episode, share it with a friend and subscribe to our show on your favorite podcast platform. You can also find show updates and SLP opportunities on our Instagram at AMN Allied. Special thanks to AMN Healthcare for making this show possible. See y'all next time.